An old man takes a quiet stroll with his granddaughter and loyal dog, seeking peace in a serene square. But when two strangers arrive and a knife is drawn, their tranquil evening turns into a life-threatening encounter where only courage and a heroic dog can decide their fate. The golden hues of the late afternoon sun bathed the small neighborhood square in a tranquil light. Joaquin, a 68-year-old retiree with a gentle demeanor, strolled along the cobbled path. His gait was slow but steady, supported by the loyal presence of his golden retriever Max, trotting beside him. Holding his free hand was Sophia, his 8-year-old granddaughter, whose laughter often punctuated the stillness of their walks. The square was a hub of calm activity. Children played near the fountain, their joyous shrieks blending with the melodic chirping of birds perched on the old oak trees. Elderly couples occupied the wooden benches, exchanging quiet conversations or simply soaking in the serenity of the day. Flower beds, carefully tended by the local community, added splashes of vibrant color to the setting, their fragrances carried gently by the breeze. Joaquin found immense comfort in these walks, a routine he had cherished since retiring. Sophia's youthful energy and Max's unwavering companionship made these moments feel timeless. Today, she eagerly narrated the story of her latest school project, her expressive hands gesturing wildly as she spoke. Joaquin chuckled, his deep, warm voice encouraging her to continue. Max, ever alert, occasionally paused to sniff at the base of a tree or glance at a passerby. His keen eyes and sharp instincts were well known in the neighborhood. A beloved fixture of the square, he was often greeted by pats and scratches behind the ears from familiar faces. As the sun began to dip closer to the horizon, the shadows of the trees stretched long and thin across the cobblestones, creating an intricate web of light and dark. The atmosphere, while still peaceful, began to shift subtly, as if the encroaching twilight carried a hint of something unfamiliar. Joaquin sensed it first, a tingling awareness at the back of his mind. He glanced around, his gaze lingering on two figures who had entered the square. They were unfamiliar, dressed in worn clothing that contrasted with the tidy appearance of the neighborhood's usual visitors. The men moved with a deliberate air, their eyes scanning the area before settling briefly on Joaquin and Sophia. Max growled softly, a low, guttural sound that Joaquin recognized as a warning. He tightened his grip on Sophia's hand and looked down at her. "Stay close to me, mi niña," he said, his voice calm but firm. Sophia, sensing his unease, nodded silently and drew nearer. The two men began to approach, their steps measured and unhurried. Joaquin's heart quickened, but he forced himself to remain composed. Max stood rigid, his body a taut line of alertness, ready to defend at a moment's notice. Joaquin's mind raced, but outwardly, he exuded the calm reassurance that had always comforted Sophia. As the men closed the distance, the tranquil ambience of the square seemed to dissolve, replaced by an invisible tension that settled like a cloud. The distant laughter of children and the chatter of couples faded into the background. Joaquin's years of life experience told him that trouble was brewing, but he refused to let fear dictate his actions. For a fleeting moment, Joaquin considered calling out to one of the neighbors seated nearby, but the men's focused gazes made him hesitate. Instead, he stood his ground, his protective instincts sharpening. With Sophia by his side and Max at the ready, Joaquin knew he would do whatever was necessary to safeguard those he loved. The men came closer, their steps now deliberate and purposeful. Joaquin instinctively shifted Sophia behind him, positioning himself as a barrier between her and the approaching strangers. Max, sensing the shift in energy, let out a deep, warning growl that reverberated through the air. "Calm down, old man," one of the men said, his voice gruff and laced with mockery. He was tall and wiry, his sharp features accentuated by a faint scar that ran down his left cheek. The other man, stockier with piercing eyes, remained silent, his gaze fixed intently on Joaquin. Together, they exuded an air of intimidation. "We don't want trouble," Joaquin said evenly, his voice betraying none of the fear simmering beneath the surface. "We're just out for a walk." The taller man chuckled, a humorless sound that sent a shiver down Sophia's spine. "Well, we don't want trouble either," he replied, his tone dripping with menace. "Just hand over whatever you've got, wallet, watch, and that bag, and we'll leave you in peace." Joaquin's heart raced as he quickly assessed the situation. Running wasn't an option. His age and Sophia's short legs would never outpace these men. Nearby, a few people glanced in their direction, but no one seemed to realize the gravity of the unfolding danger. Max, however, was fully aware. His body tensed, his sharp eyes locked on the men, and his growl deepened into a menacing snarl. "Easy, Max," Joaquin murmured, placing a hand on the dog's head. But even as he spoke, Joaquin knew Max was ready to act. The stockier man, Diego, took a step closer, his hand slipping into his jacket. A moment later, he produced a knife, its blade catching the fading sunlight. Sophia gasped, clutching Joaquin's arm tightly, her small fingers trembling. Joaquin instinctively pulled her closer, shielding her from view. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Diego said, his voice low and threatening. The blade hovered in the air, a silent promise of violence. The other man, Armando, stepped to his side, his expression hardening. Joaquin raised his hand slowly, a gesture of compliance meant to diffuse the tension. "Look," he began, his tone calm but firm. "I don't have much, but whatever I have, you can take. Just let the girl go. She's only a child." Armando smirked, shaking his head. "It's not just about the money, viejo. It's about respect. People like you think you own this place. Time to show you otherwise." Max barked sharply, the sound startling even Joaquin for a moment. The dog took a step forward, his teeth bared and his stance aggressive. Armando flinched, his confidence faltering slightly as he glanced at the dog. "Control that mutt," Diego snapped, waving the knife threateningly. Joaquin didn't move, his eyes flicking between the blade and Max. Inside, his mind was racing. Every second counted. "Let us be," Joaquin said again, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "We're not worth the trouble you'll bring on yourselves." But his words fell on deaf ears. Armando lunged forward, his hand outstretched for Joaquin's bag. In that moment, Max erupted into action, leaping forward with a ferocity that caught everyone off guard. His powerful jaws clamped down on Armando's arm, eliciting a scream of pain and surprise. Diego shouted, raising the knife as he moved to help his partner. Joaquin seized the opportunity, pulling Sophia away and taking several steps back. "Run to that bench," he instructed her, pointing to a spot where a group of onlookers had begun to notice the commotion. Sophia hesitated, her wide eyes darting between her grandfather and the chaos. "Go!" Joaquin urged, his voice sharper now. Reluctantly, she obeyed, her small figure disappearing into the growing crowd. The confrontation was far from over. The square, once so peaceful, had become a battleground where instincts and courage would be tested. The air seemed to crackle with tension as Max sank his teeth deeper into Armando's arm, his growls reverberating like thunder. Armando flailed, yelling in pain as he tried to shake the dog off. The knife he had been clutching clattered to the ground, spinning across the cobblestones. "Get this mud off me!" Armando bellowed, his voice rising in panic. Blood began to seep through his torn sleeve, staining the fabric as Max held firm, his powerful jaws refusing to let go. Diego, momentarily frozen by the sudden turn of events, snapped back into action. He lunged forward, brandishing his knife, his intent clear, to harm Max. But the dog, as if anticipating the move, released Armando just in time and darted to the side, avoiding Diego's wild swing. Max barked fiercely, positioning himself between the two men and Joaquin, his protective instincts in full force. His movements were calculated and swift, every fiber of his being focused on neutralizing the threat. Armando stumbled backward, cradling his injured arm, his confidence now replaced by fear. "Stay back," Joaquin shouted, his voice ringing out with unexpected authority. He bent down and picked up a sturdy stick that lay near the edge of the path. His hands trembled slightly, but his resolve was unshakable. Diego hesitated, eyeing both Joaquin and the relentless Max. The square had grown quieter, the usual sounds of children playing and adults chatting replaced by murmurs of concern from the gathering crowd. The onlookers, initially unsure of how to react, began inching closer, their presence adding pressure to the unfolding scene. Diego took a step toward Joaquin, knife raised, but Max was faster. With a fierce growl, the dog lunged at him, his teeth snapping just inches from Diego's wrist. The man yelped and stumbled backward, his knife slipping from his grasp as he fell to the ground. "You idiot, get up!" Armando yelled, his voice cracking with frustration. But Diego, now face to face with Max's bared teeth, seemed paralyzed by fear. The golden retriever, though not physically large, radiated an energy that left no doubt about his willingness to fight. "Enough!" Joaquin commanded, stepping forward with the stick raised. "Leave now or you'll regret it." Armando and Diego exchanged a frantic glance. With Diego still on the ground and Armando clutching his wounded arm, The odds were no longer in their favor. Max stood his ground, his sharp eyes darting between the two men, ready to spring again at the slightest provocation. The tension reached its peak as Armando stumbled backward, pulling Diego to his feet. "This isn't over," he hissed, glaring at Joaquin. But his bravado rang hollow, and the two men began retreating, their steps hurried and uneven. Max remained poised, his gaze fixed on the fleeing men, until they disappeared into the shadows beyond the square. Only then did he relax, his tail wagging slightly as he turned to Joaquin. Joaquin knelt beside his loyal companion, his voice filled with gratitude. "You saved us, Max," he whispered, running a trembling hand over the dog's head. "You're a hero." Armando and Diego didn't go far. Huddled near the edge of the square, hidden by the thick shadows of a line of old trees, they licked their wounds, both literal and figurative. Armando ripped off a piece of his shirt to wrap around the bite wound on his arm, his face contorted in pain. "This isn't how it ends," he spat, glaring back toward the square. From their vantage point, they could see Joaquin cradling Sofia protectively while neighbors gathered, murmuring in low voices. Max, vigilant and tireless, still stood guard, his ears perked and body tense. "You sure about that?" Diego muttered, his confidence clearly shaken. He rubbed his shoulder, where he had landed hard on the cobblestones after Max's attack. "That dog's a demon." Armando turned to him sharply, his eyes blazing. "They humiliated us, that old man, that brat, and that damn dog. We have to show them who's in charge." "How?" Diego challenged. "We don't have weapons anymore, and that dog—" "Enough!" Armando cut him off, his voice low but furious. "We'll use the crowd against them, create a distraction. That mutt won't know what hit him." The two men skulked back toward the square, staying out of sight. Meanwhile, Joaquin had ushered Sofia to the safety of a nearby bench, where a kind elderly woman had wrapped her in a shawl and offered her water. Max remained close to Joaquin, his sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. But the calm was short-lived. From the shadows, Armando suddenly emerged, shouting, "That dog is dangerous! It attacked us without reason!" His loud, accusing voice turned heads. Diego followed suit, clutching his shoulder and limping, playing the victim to draw sympathy from the gathering crowd. "They set their dog on us," Armando continued, pointing an accusing finger at Joaquin. "They're the ones causing trouble here." The crowd, uncertain and confused, murmured among themselves. Some people who hadn't witnessed the initial attack began to cast skeptical glances at Joaquin and Max. One man stepped forward hesitantly. "Is that true? Did your dog attack these men?" Joaquin stood tall, his hand resting on Max's head. "My dog acted to protect us," he said firmly. "These men tried to rob us, and one of them pulled a knife. Max saved my granddaughter and me." "You expect us to believe that?" Armando scoffed, holding up his makeshift bandage. "Look at this! That dog's a menace!" The tension in the square grew thick, but Max, sensing the need for restraint, remained still. Joaquin looked around, searching for someone who had seen the confrontation unfold. A young mother holding her toddler stepped forward hesitantly. I saw them pull a knife," she said, her voice trembling. "The dog was just protecting them." Her words bolstered Joaquin's confidence. "Max did what any of us would do for our family," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "These men came here with bad intentions. Look at them. They're the ones who should be questioned." Armando and Diego, realizing they were losing control of the narrative, exchanged a panicked glance. Armando hissed under his breath, "This isn't working. Let's go." Before they could slip away, Max let out a sharp bark, drawing all eyes to the fleeing men. The crowd, now fully aware of their guilt, closed ranks, preventing their escape. "Someone call the police!" a voice shouted. Max barked again, a sound of triumph as he and Joaquin stood side by side, watching as the tables turned once more. The energy in the square shifted as the crowd, galvanized by Joaquin's words and Max's unwavering presence, began to close in on Armando and Diego. The two men, who had once exuded menace, now looked cornered and uncertain. Their earlier bravado had all but vanished. "Don't let them leave," someone shouted from the gathering group. The call was met with murmurs of agreement, and soon, several men and women stepped forward to form a loose circle around the would-be attackers. Joaquin, now standing closer to the bench where Sofia sat safely with the elderly woman, watched the scene unfold with quiet resolve. He kept a reassuring hand on Max, who, though no longer growling, remained alert and watchful. Joaquin bent down and whispered, "Good boy. You've done more than enough." Max wagged his tail slightly but kept his gaze fixed on Armando and Diego. As the crowd pressed in, the bandits exchanged frantic glances. "This is all a misunderstanding," Diego tried, raising his hands defensively. "We weren't trying to hurt anyone." "Misunderstanding?" a man from the crowd scoffed. "You pulled a knife on an old man and a little girl." Another woman, still holding her toddler, stepped closer. "And you expect us to believe you're the victims? That dog was just protecting his family." The murmurs grew louder, anger simmering in the voices of the neighbors who had come to Joaquin's aid. The tight-knit community, once oblivious to the unfolding danger, now stood united against the common threat. "Call the police," Joaquin said, his voice carrying authority. "They need to answer for what they've done." Several people reached for their phones, dialing emergency services as the bandits continued to plead their case. "We didn't mean anything by it," Armando stammered, clutching his injured arm. "We just wanted a little help, that's all." "Help?" Joaquin's voice was sharp, cutting through their lies. "You came here to rob us. You threatened my granddaughter, and you attacked an innocent dog. Don't try to twist the truth." The crowd murmured in agreement, closing the circle tighter. Armando and Diego now stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes darting in search of an escape route, but there was none. Max barked once, a sharp, commanding sound that made even some onlookers jump. "Easy, boy," Joaquin said softly, patting Max's head. He glanced at Sofia, who was watching with wide, tearful eyes. Her fear had given way to cautious relief as she realized the danger was finally being contained. It wasn't long before the distant sound of sirens echoed through the square. The crowd parted slightly, allowing space for the incoming police vehicles. A collective sense of relief rippled through the group as the flashing lights drew closer. Joaquin knelt beside Sofia, pulling her into a protective embrace. "It's almost over," he murmured, kissing the top of her head. Max sat beside them, his golden fur glowing faintly in the dim light, as if he, too, understood that justice was near. The wail of sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of the police, and the tension in the square began to ebb. The gathered neighbors, emboldened by their collective courage, maintained their makeshift perimeter around the two bandits, ensuring they had no way out. Armando and Diego stood in the center of the crowd, their faces pale and glistening with sweat. Armando's injured arm was still crudely wrapped in his torn shirt, while Diego glanced nervously at the surrounding people, his defiance crumbling under their sharp, unforgiving glares. Max remained at the forefront, his stance steady, as if daring the men to make another move. Though his earlier ferocity had subdued, his alert eyes stayed locked on the pair. He seemed to understand that his work was not yet complete. A ripple of movement ran through the crowd as the first police car pulled up, its blue and red lights casting flashing reflections against the windows of nearby buildings. Two officers stepped out, their uniforms crisp and their expressions serious as they assessed the situation. A third officer followed closely behind, her radio crackling with updates from dispatch. One of the officers approached Joaquin, who stood near the bench where Sofia now sat, with her small hands wrapped tightly around Max's leash. "Sir, can you tell us what happened here?" the officer asked, his voice calm but firm. Joaquin nodded and began recounting the events in measured detail. He described the men's initial approach, their threats, the knife, and how Max had acted to protect him and Sofia. His voice carried a quiet strength, and though his words were deliberate, they left no room for doubt. As Joaquin spoke, other witnesses stepped forward to corroborate his story. The young mother with her toddler described seeing the knife, and an elderly man who had been sitting nearby added that he'd heard Armando's threats. The crowd's unified testimony painted a damning picture of the two bandits' intentions. The officers turned their attention to Armando and Diego, who had remained silent, their heads lowered in shame. "Is this true?" one of the officers asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Armando opened his mouth as if to speak, but Diego interrupted, his voice shaky. "We didn't mean for it to go this far," he stammered. "We just thought, we didn't know the dog would—" "Enough," the officer cut him off, her voice sharp. She turned to her colleague. "Cuff them both." The second officer stepped forward, pulling handcuffs from his belt. Armando protested weakly, but neither man resisted as their wrists were bound. The once menacing pair now looked small and defeated, their earlier arrogance extinguished. As the officers led the men toward the patrol car, the crowd erupted into a quiet cheer. Some neighbors clapped. others murmured words of relief and gratitude. Max barked once, his tail wagging as he felt the tension lift. Joaquin knelt beside Max, his voice soft but full of emotion. "You did it, boy! You kept us safe!" The officer who had taken Joaquin's statement crouched down, her stern expression softening as she looked at Max. "This dog's a hero," she said. "He deserves a medal." The words brought a small, proud smile to Joaquin's face. He glanced at Sophia, who now wore a brave but tired expression. "He's more than a hero," Joaquin replied. "He's family." As the police car drove away, carrying Armando and Diego into custody, the square began to return to its usual calm. But for Joaquin, Sophia, and the neighbors who had stood together, the evening had left an indelible mark, a reminder of the strength found in unity and the courage of one extraordinary dog. The police car disappeared down the narrow street, its flashing lights fading into the distance. The square, now illuminated by street lamps, began to settle into an uneasy calm. Joaquin stood with Max by his side, the adrenaline that had sustained him throughout the ordeal finally ebbing away. He let out a slow, measured breath, his hand instinctively resting on Max's head. A pair of officers stayed behind to gather more details and ensure everything was under control. One approached Joaquin again, holding a notepad. "We'll need your full account for our report," the officer said, her voice kinder this time. "But first, how's your granddaughter? And the dog? He seems unharmed?" Joaquin glanced over at Sophia, who was still sitting on the bench with the elderly woman who had stayed by her side. She looked tired but safe, her small hand stroking Max's fur whenever he came near. "Sophia is shaken, but she'll be okay," Joaquin replied, his voice steady despite the evening's events. "Max, well, I'll have the vet check him just in case. He's the one who kept us safe." The officer nodded, jotting down a few notes before offering a faint smile. "He's a brave one, that's for sure. Not many dogs would face danger like that." A small group of neighbors lingered, their voices low as they exchanged their versions of what had happened. Some approached Joaquin, patting his shoulder or offering kind words. "You've got a remarkable dog there," one of the men said, nodding toward Max. "If it weren't for him?" Joaquin simply nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Words felt insufficient to express his gratitude toward Max, who now sat quietly at his feet, his tail sweeping the ground in slow, rhythmic motions. The dog seemed at ease, as though the danger had never existed. As the officers wrapped up their investigation, one turned to Joaquin. "We've got everything we need for now. If we require additional information, we'll be in touch. Rest assured, those two won't be causing any more trouble." "Thank you, officer," Joaquin said sincerely. The officer gave him a firm nod before departing with her colleague. The crowd began to disperse, some returning to their homes, while others lingered in small groups, still buzzing about the night's events. Joaquin walked over to Sophia and knelt down in front of her. "Are you all right, mi niña?" he asked, his voice soft. Sophia nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I was so scared, abuelo," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But Max? He's the bravest dog in the whole world." Joaquin pulled her into a gentle hug, his heart swelling with pride. "Yes, he is," he agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "And you're the bravest girl for staying so strong." Max pressed his nose against Sophia's arm, drawing a giggle from the girl despite her exhaustion. Joaquin smiled, knowing they had faced the danger together and emerged stronger. Justice had been served, and their family, thanks to Max, was safe once again. The square was quiet now, the echoes of the earlier chaos replaced by the rustle of leaves in the gentle night breeze. Joaquin, with Sophia walking beside him and Max trotting just ahead, began the short journey home. The events of the evening weighed heavily on them all, but a sense of relief and gratitude enveloped the small group. Max, though still alert, moved slower than usual. Joaquin noticed the subtle limp in the dog's stride and the faint red stain marring the golden fur of his flank. "You're hurt, boy," Joaquin murmured, kneeling to inspect Max's side under the soft glow of a street lamp. The wound was shallow, likely a graze from Diego's knife, but it was enough to make Joaquin's chest tighten with concern. Sophia crouched beside them, her small hands gently touching Max's ear. "He's so brave, abuelo. We have to make sure he's okay." Joaquin nodded. "We will, mi niña. Let's get him to the vet right away." They altered their route, heading toward the nearby veterinary clinic. The clinic was still open, its warm light spilling onto the sidewalk as they approached. Inside, a kind-faced veterinarian greeted them with a calm professionalism that immediately set Joaquin at ease. "Come on in," she said, gesturing to the examination room. Max hesitated for a moment, glancing back at Joaquin as if seeking reassurance, before stepping forward obediently. Sophia watched nervously from a nearby chair while Joaquin stayed close to Max during the examination. The veterinarian cleaned the wound carefully, her movements precise yet gentle. "It's not deep," she assured Joaquin. "He'll be just fine with some rest and antibiotics to prevent infection." Joaquin exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with genuine gratitude. He stroked Max's head as the dog remained still, his intelligent eyes fixed on Joaquin, as if understanding the care he was receiving. As the veterinarian finished dressing the wound, she paused to look at Joaquin. "It's rare to see a dog act so instinctively to protect his family," she said. "You've got a remarkable companion." Joaquin smiled faintly, his hand never leaving Max's head. "He's more than a companion. He's part of the family." With Max patched up, they made their way back home. Sophia clung to Joaquin's hand, her other hand resting lightly on Max's back as if she, too, wanted to ensure his safety. Once inside their cozy home, Max settled into his favorite spot near the fireplace, his tail wagging lazily as Sophia brought him a bowl of fresh water. Joaquin sank into his chair with a tired sigh, watching as Sophia knelt beside Max, whispering softly to him about how brave he had been. His heart swelled with pride and love. Tonight had tested their strength, but it had also reaffirmed what mattered most: family, loyalty, and the quiet heroism of their four-legged protector. As Max drifted off into a peaceful sleep, Joaquin leaned back, his eyes heavy with fatigue. "You've earned your rest, Max," he said softly. "You're our hero." The morning sun rose gently over the neighborhood, casting warm rays across the familiar square. The events of the previous evening still lingered in Joaquin's mind, but as he stepped into the square with Sophia and Max, the air felt lighter, almost renewed. There was a sense of quiet celebration among the people already gathered there. The square, once merely a place for casual strolls and idle conversation, had transformed into a symbol of resilience and community. The same cobblestones where fear had taken root now seemed brighter, as if cleansed by the courage and unity shown the night before. Joaquin walked slowly, his hand resting on Max's back. The dog, though bandaged, held his head high, his steps steady. Sophia skipped ahead, her energy restored, occasionally looking back to make sure her grandfather and Max were keeping up. As they reached the center of the square, Joaquin noticed something unusual. A group of neighbors had gathered near the fountain, many of them holding bouquets of flowers and small signs. A banner hung between two trees, its hand-painted letters reading, "Thank you, Max." Joaquin's breath caught, and Sophia clapped her hands in delight. "Look, abuelo, they made this for Max." The crowd turned as they approached, and a cheer erupted. "There he is," someone called out. "Our hero!" Max stopped, tilting his head curiously as the people began to surround them, their faces lit with admiration. Children reached out to pet him, and adults showered Joaquin with handshakes and words of gratitude. "Your dog is incredible, Joaquin," one man said, his voice filled with awe. "He showed us all what true courage looks like." Joaquin, touched by the outpouring of affection, smiled humbly. Max only did what he felt was right. He's always been a protector. A young woman stepped forward with a small, intricately wrapped box. "We made this for him," she said, crouching to meet Max's gaze. She opened the box to reveal a gleaming collar with a gold tag engraved with the words "Hero of the Square." Joaquin's eyes glistened as he gently took the collar and fastened it around Max's neck. "You deserve this, boy," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Max wagged his tail, looking up at Joaquin with unwavering loyalty. The crowd clapped and cheered as Max gave a joyful bark, his energy returning despite the previous night's ordeal. Sophia knelt beside him, wrapping her arms around his neck. "You're the best dog in the whole world," she whispered, her words carrying the innocence and sincerity of childhood. As the celebration continued, Joaquin felt a deep sense of pride, not just for Max, but for the community that had come together in their time of need. The square, once a simple gathering place, now stood as a testament to their shared strength and unity. By late morning, the crowd began to disperse, but the warmth lingered. Joaquin and Sophia sat on their favorite bench, Max resting at their feet. The banner still fluttered in the breeze, a reminder of the courage that had turned fear into triumph. Joaquin gazed at the square, his heart full. "This place feels different now," he said to Sophia. "It's not just a square anymore. It's a place where people came together, where Max showed us all what it means to be brave." Sophia nodded, her face glowing with happiness. "It's our square, abuelo, and Max made it safe for everyone." Joaquin smiled, his hand resting gently on Max's head. "Yes, mi niña, he truly did." As they watched children play by the fountain and neighbors exchange warm greetings, Joaquin knew that the square would never be the same, not because of the danger they had faced, but because of the hope, courage, and unity that had risen in its wake. The next day, the morning light streamed through the curtains of Joaquin's small, cozy home. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the sound of Sophia's laughter as she played with Max in the living room. The dog, still wearing his new collar, wagged his tail as he gently tugged at a toy Sophia dangled in front of him. Joaquin sat by the window, his coffee cup warming his hands, gazing thoughtfully out at the street. The events of the past days played over in his mind. Fear had come close to his family, but bravery, loyalty, and unity had triumphed. The lessons were clear, yet profound. "Abuelo, come play with us." Sophia's cheerful voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned toward her, smiling. "In a moment, mi niña," he said, setting down his cup and rising from his chair. He walked over to them, kneeling beside Max, who immediately leaned into Joaquin's touch. "You're a good boy, Max," he said, his voice filled with affection. The dog looked up at him with his soulful eyes, and Joaquin could see the same unwavering devotion that had defined Max's every action. Sophia climbed onto Joaquin's knee, wrapping her arms around him. "Abuelo, Max isn't just a good boy, he's the best boy. He saved us." Joaquin kissed the top of her head. "He did, Sophia. And do you know what else he did?" She tilted her head curiously. "What?" "He taught us something important," Joaquin said. "He showed us what it means to be brave, not just with actions, but with your heart." Max didn't think about his own safety. He thought about protecting us because that's what love does. Sophia nodded, her young mind absorbing the weight of her grandfather's words. "So being brave means helping the people we love?" "Yes," Joaquin replied, "and sometimes even helping people we don't know. Bravery isn't about being fearless. It's about doing the right thing even when we're afraid." Sophia's eyes lit up with understanding. "Like the neighbors, they helped us too." "Exactly," Joaquin said. "Together, we're stronger. That's why this neighborhood is special, and that's why Max is more than just a dog. He's a symbol of how love and loyalty can overcome even the darkest moments." Sophia beamed, hugging both Joaquin and Max tightly. The warmth of her embrace filled Joaquin with a deep sense of gratitude. This moment, simple yet profound, encapsulated the resilience of their family and the bond that had been strengthened through adversity. Later that afternoon, they decided to return to the square, this time for a leisurely stroll without the shadow of danger. Joaquin walked slowly, his hand on Sophia's shoulder, and Max leading the way, his steps steady and confident. The square was lively again, filled with laughter and chatter, but there was a subtle shift in how people greeted them. Neighbors paused to smile, wave, or stop for a kind word. Children ran up to pet Max, calling him a hero. The once ordinary walks now carried a sense of purpose, a reminder of what they had all endured and overcome. As the sun began to set, Joaquin and Sophia sat together on their favorite bench. Max rested at their feet, his head on his paws, content and calm. The fountain sparkled in the fading light, and the gentle hum of the square provided a soothing backdrop. Joaquin looked at Sophia, her face glowing with the innocence and hope of childhood. "Always remember, mi niña, that no matter what happens, we face it together, and with love, loyalty, and courage, we can get through anything." She nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I promise, abuelo, I'll always be brave, just like Max." Joaquin smiled, his heart full. The world around them felt peaceful again, and he knew that with Max by their side and the lessons they had learned, they could face whatever the future held. The day faded into a serene twilight, but in Joaquin's heart, a new light shone, a light of hope, unity, and the unbreakable bond of family. In the end, this story reminds us that true bravery isn't about being fearless. It's about standing up for those you love, even when the odds are against you. Max's loyalty and courage saved the day, but it also showed how a community coming together can turn fear into strength. If you were in Joaquin's shoes, how would you have handled that moment? Would you have been as brave as Max? Click the video on your screen now to continue this journey of self-discovery and find more inspiring stories that might change the way you see the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on the lessons life has to teach us. See you in the next story.